Now look at the coagulation kinin pathways. First and foremost, we look at the extrinsic pathway. For the extrinsic pathway, why do we call it extrinsic? Basically, it's because the trigger comes from outside the blood. When a vessel is injured, blood is exposed to tissue factor. The tissue factor is basically which factor is this? Tissue factor is factor 3, right? So this tissue factor is factor 3. Blood is exposed to tissue factor 3. Where is tissue factor normally located? In damaged tissues, fibroblasts, smooth muscle cells, subendothelial cells. It is not normally circulating in the blood. Some kind of damage is going to provoke it. And that is going to bind to the 7 and make it into 7A. Whenever we say A, we're saying that something is activated, right? And whenever we have these red stars, this basically means that this step requires calcium and phospholipids. Okay, okay. So now the extrinsic pathway is triggered, and we're moving on to creating factor 10A from factor 10. So factor 10A creates factor 10A, right? Another thing, this also requires calcium and phospholipids, right? Right? Okay. So one thing I would like to mention here is that warfarin decreases 7 first. So warfarin, when we give warfarin as a medicine, it decreases this factor first. And that's why your PT time is increased, right? PT is basically your prothrombin time, right? It basically tests the extrinsic pathway, right? And it also tests the common pathway. This is the common pathway, this 10 becoming the 10A, right? Because you see that the intrinsic pathway also comes here, right? And this extrinsic pathway also goes here, right? So this is your common pathway. So when we give warfarin, this PT time, this prothrombin time increases, right? Okay, so this is extrinsic. For intrinsic, you remember the tissue factor. The tissue factor binds to the 7 to convert it into 7A, and that converts it into 10A from the 10, right? So 10 becomes this tissue factor, and 7A together create the 10A from the 10, right? And then that basically starts your plotting, right? Okay, before I move into more details, let's look at the intrinsic pathway also. So intrinsic pathway, how is it different? The intrinsic pathway starts with some collagen, basement membrane, and activated platelets, right? So this is the intrinsic pathway. It starts with the contact activation, right? So there's contact activation and there's collagen, basement membrane activated platelets. This is when the blood touches the collagen. That's why we call it the contact pathway. Okay, so this starts with the factor 12 converting into factor 12A, and this 12A converts factor 11 into 11A. Both these activated 12 and activated 11 can be inhibited by C1 esterase inhibitor. Okay, that is something you should know. I'm going to talk about the drugs while I'm teaching the steps because that is how a better understanding can be made. Okay, so remember that in the intrinsic pathway we start with factor 12, which is converted into 12A, and this 12A then goes ahead and converts the 11 into 11A, right? Now the C1 esterase inhibitor, what does it basically do? It is a regulatory protein that acts like the brake on parts of the complement and coagulation systems. What does it inhibit? Inhibits the factor 12A. It also goes ahead and inhibits the kallikrein. We'll look at the kinin cascade later. This is called as the kinin cascade. We'll look at it later on. And it also inhibits the C1R and C1S of the classic complement pathway. Right, so basically what this does is it goes ahead and it inhibits the factor 12A, it inhibits the kinin pathway through kallikrein, it also inhibits the classical complement pathway. Why is it important? Because without C1, the body produces C1 inhibitor, the body produces too much bradykinin. Bradykinin causes vasodilation, increased vascular permeability, and tissue swelling, right? So deficiency of the C1 INH causes angioedema, right? That is something I want to to know entire thing here. Okay, moving on to the 12 being converted into 12A, which is converting the 11 into 11A. Now you have the 9 being converted into 9A, right? Again, this step is using calcium and phospholipid. And whenever something is pink, we know it is inhibited by vitamin K antagonist warfarin. So I told you that warfarin decreases the 7, and now warfarin also decreases the 9. Warfarin also works on this common pathway. Warfarin also works on factor 2, right? Well, anyways, we'll come to that later on. We're at this step, right? So we're converting the 9A from 9. Now, this 9A, what this basically does is this 9A then with the 8A. Now, this 9A, what it needs is it also needs 8A, right? So let's go ahead and remove all these lines here so we can get a clean picture of our system. Okay. So at this point, we know that this 9A needs the 8A. Now, where is the 8A? I told you that the 8A exists in the endothelial cells with the von Willebrand factor, right? So when we have a von Willebrand factor disease, you also have an 8 problem, right? So this 8 is very important because it, together with the 9A, so I told you that when there's a deficiency of 8. Okay, by the way, when there is deficiency of factor 8, you know what it's called? It's very important. It's called hemophilia A, right? So there's poor intrinsic pathway, and that leads to bleeding. So that's a tine I would like to put in here. Here, hemophilia A is a deficiency of factor 8, right? So you can see this, we don't have this 8 basically, so there's no 8A, and this intrinsic pathway would not go on. The only pathway clotting you have is the extrinsic pathway. Okay, moving on. Another thing, why is the von Willebrand factor attached to 8? Because the von Willebrand factor protects the factor 8 from destruction. So you think of the von Willebrand factor like a bodyguard, and you think of factor 8 as some VIP person, right? So without the von Willebrand factor, the factor 8 falls. This is why von Willebrand disease causes platelet problems and coagulation problems. Okay, so now you've created this complex of 8A and 9O, right? This complex basically goes ahead and converges in the common pathway where the 10 is being converted into 10A, right? Okay. So now at this common pathway, you have the 10 being converted into 10A. This is the common pathway. Extrinsic and intrinsic both come and meet here. Now, what does 10A do? The 10A is very important. It converts prothrombin into thrombin, right? Um, Now, this step basically needs some things. First of all, this step also needs calcium and phospholipids. Then it also needs factor 5A, right? Can you see how there's factor 5 here and it's been converted into 5A here? So this step of this 9A, this 10A, the common pathway, the step of 10A being used to convert prothrombin, which is a factor 2, into 3A, needs calcium, needs phospholipid, and it needs the factor 5 to be converted into factor 5A. So these are the steps that this step of factor 10A using the prothrombin to convert it into prothrombin to convert it into thrombin needs, right? Okay, so that's done here. Now together 10A and 5A, this is called the prothrombinase complex. When we use the 10A and 5A, this complex together, we call it the prothrombinase complex. Thrombin is the boss, right? Because thrombin is the boss. Everything revolves around thrombin. Thrombin is, by the way, 2A. Okay, so thrombin is 2A and it's the boss, right? That's something you can remember about it. It makes fibrin. What does the thrombin do? It makes fibrin, right? It converts fibrinogen into fibrin. As you can see, it converts this fibrinogen into fibrin, fibrin monomers of fibrin. And this basically, what this does, it activates more 5 to 5A, right? So this fibrinogen to fibrin goes and converts more 5A from the 5, right? And what this basically does is it starts this fibrinogen complex, right? So fibrin formation, you can remember that the thrombin amplifies its own production by activating 5 to 5A, 8 to 8A, and 13 to 13A. We'll look at 13 later on. Okay. So at this point, we know that the fibrinogen to fibrin monomers converts more 5 into 5A, right? And also this thrombin also activates more 8. This more 8 is converted to more 8A, right? So this is also an amplification step. Amplification means that there's more chain reaction happening of things together, right? Once something happens, it happens over and over again. That's chain reaction. Okay. Now, so the next step that we're going to look at is basically the fibrin formation. So the fibrinogen is converted into fibrin monomers, right? So thrombin converts the fibrinogen into fibrin monomers. Now, but these monomers are weak. They are weak at this point. These monomers are weak. So we need to aggregate them and make them strong. Like we need a stable clot, right? We need aggregation of these fibrin monomers. This is what they're showing as aggregation. Now, this aggregation basically means factor 13A, this factor 13A, to be converted by factor 13. So factor 13 converts itself into factor 13A using what? This thrombin. This thrombin goes and converts this factor 13 into factor 13A. And by the way, along with calcium. So calcium is really needed here. So along with calcium, you are going to form a stable fibrin mesh here. This is a stable fibrin mesh. This fibrin monomer is not stable yet, right? It needs to be created into this mesh, this big mesh, right? Another thing that I'm going to mention here now is we said that there's a factor 8 deficiency, which is hemophilia A, right? So no factor 8 is hemophilia A. Again, now if there's no factor 9, now if there's no factor 9, this factor 9, then you get hemophilia B. So hemophilia B is no factor 9, no factor 8 is hemophilia A, and then the deficiency of factor 11 is hemophilia C. Okay, this deficiency of 11 is basically hemophilia C. So this 8 is hemophilia A, no A 8 is hemophilia A, no 9 is hemophilia B, and then no 11 is hemophilia C, right? Okay. Now, factor 8 is a cement factor. You can think about the clot forming, right? But it falls apart later. So factor 8 is used to form the actual fibrin monomers, but the clot needs to become a big mesh, and that needs your factor 13 to be converted into 13A, right? So this is the final clot that does not fall apart, right? Okay. Now we have something as protein C and protein S deficiency. Okay, so let's look at protein C and protein S. So protein C and protein S are basically activated by thrombin. Okay, so basically thrombin goes and activates protein C and protein S. And now what this does is basically protein C and protein S, they destroy 5A and 7A. What these do is they destroy. So the protein CNS destroy 5A and 7A. If you're destroying 5A and 7A, if you're destroying this 5A here and you're destroying the 7A here, what are you going to do? You're basically going to naturally anticoagulate, like you're going to stop clotting, right? So protein C and S are natural anticoagulants. And we have specific deficiencies where we don't have protein C or S. There's specific diseases where there's a deficiency of protein C and S, right? Okay, that is something I wanted to know here. Okay, another thing, uh, let's talk about the thrombolytics. Okay, so we have thrombolytics like alteplase, retiplase, streptokinase, and tenecteplase, right? So all these places that we're talking about, what do they basically do? Now this alteplase, retiplase, tenecteplase, and streptokinase, they are basically drugs that activate plasmin. Okay, so can you see this plus sign here? These are all thrombolytics. They're basically drugs that activate plasmin. And what is the plasmin doing basically? Um, okay, so I just said that these thrombolytics activate the plasmin, right? So plasmin is the body's clot scissors, right? So when a clot forms, what plasmin basically does is it breaks this fibrin mesh down. It leads to fibrin degradation, and the products are basically D dimers. Sometimes in medical ICUs, you see very high D dimers. What do high D dimers basically represent? High D dimers show you that fibrin clot is constantly being broken down. A lot of fibrin clots are being broken down. So you see high D dimers in cases like DVT, pulmonary embolism, and DIC, right? So a high D dimer is a scary situation. You either are dealing with a deep vein thrombosis or a pulmonary embolism or disseminated intravascular coagulation. All three are scary, right? Okay. So we have thrombolytics like alteplase, reteplase, streptokinase, and tenecteplase being used in the medicine when we have to break down the clots in cases like stroke or myocardial infarction, STEMI basically, and massive pulmonary embolism. In massive pulmonary embolism, we want to break down the clot. We cannot risk the clot leading to hypoperfusion. Okay. Then we have antifibrinolytics. Antifibrinolytics are such as like tranexamic acid, aminocaproic acid. Okay, so even other like so tranexamic acid, aminocaproic acid. Now, antifibrinolytics are going to have the opposite effect. They're going to stop the clot from breaking down. Now, when would you ever want your body to not clot? I don't get it, right? When would you ever want your body to not clot? Why would you want to bleed? uh like I'm asking the opposite question. So antifibrinolytics are basically stopping this fibrin from breaking down. So the question goes that when would you want your body to form a clot? Right? You would want your body to bleed the clots when you are scared of something like a stroke happening, a pulmonary embolism happening, a myocardial infarction happening. You do not want the clots to form. So you give medicines like alteplase, reteplase, streptokinase, tenecteplase to break the clot down, right? So everything gets oxygen properly. But there are some cases where you do not want the bleeding to happen. You want to decrease the bleeding. Right? Can you think about cases where you want to decrease bleeding? Okay, so I'll give you examples like heavy menstrual bleeding. In heavy menstrual bleeding, we give tranexamic acid. In surgical bleeding, we give these medicines, and also in trauma, we give these medicines because we want the clotting to happen. We need to decrease bleeding, right? Okay, that is a clinical time we had to study. Then now, I told you that your 10 to 10A was a very important step because this is a common pathway. So, in medicine, we have a lot of drugs that target this 10 to 10A pathway, right? So, you have example that literally inhibits 10A. Now, which medicine literally inhibits 10A? Your low molecular weight heparin, like enoxaparin and dalteparin. I'll show it to you here. So look at this. This low molecular weight heparin like dalteparin and enoxaparin. What this basically does is heparin is a direct 10A inhibitors. You also have like some 10A inhibitors like apaxaban, right? All these basically block the 10A either directly or indirectly. Apaxaban blocks it directly, right? Heparin also mostly inhibits the 10A. And then we have this specific drug called dabigatran. Dabigatran is different in its way that it's a direct thrombin inhibitor. It blocks this 2A, right? So this 2A, this thrombin is inhibited by this dabigatran. Okay. This is a direct thrombin inhibitor, this dabigatran. Okay. So we have some anticoagulants that are 10A inhibitors, and then we have this thrombin inhibitors, the dabigatran, right? That is something I've explained to you. Now you need to move on to the kinin pathway. The kinin cascade here is very important because it explains basically why angioedema happens. Now, This kallikrein, what happens is that when your 12A is activated, you know, the 12, when factor 12 activates, when your 12A is activated, what happens is that it activates pre-kallikrein to become kallikrein. So there's a molecule called pre-kallikrein. That pre-kallikrein becomes kallikrein when your 12A is activated. And that basically creates bradykinin. What does bradykinin do? Bradykinin causes vasodilation, permeability, and pain. All this is basically your kinin cascade, right? So bradykinin, how do you get bradykinin? With high molecular weight kallikrein, right? So this kallikrein basically high molecular weight this high molecular weight kininogen, this high molecular weight kininogen, this is one of those coagulation complement kinin system proteins that kine in a lot of places, right? So the kinin system basically goes something like the system produces the bradykinin, which leads to vasodilation, increased vascular permeability and pain, right? But where does this HMWK high molecular weight kininogen come from? It's the precursor from which bradykinin is made. That's it, right? So the high molecular weight kininogen or K is basically your precursor of bradykinin, right? And when factor 12 is converted into 12A, this converts the pre-kallikrein into kallikrein, which uses the HMWK and converts it into bradykinin, right? And this basically leads to your vasodilation, permeability, and pain, right? Okay. Now what happens is when there's this C1 esterase inhibitor, the C1 esterase inhibitor basically affects the factor 12A. It inhibits that and it inhibits the kallikrein both, right? Both are inhibited. If C1 inhibitor, if this inhibitor is deficient, right, we get something called as hereditary angioedema. Now, why do you get hereditary angioedema? Because when this inhibitor is deficient, you will have a lot of this and you will have a lot of this, right? There's no inhibitor going on. So you will have a lot of vasodilation, permeability, and pain, right? But there's no itching because there's no histamine, right? There's just vasodilation, permeability, and pain. The problem is too much bradykinin, not histamine. So that is something that you can remember. I think we have completed everything on this image. I really hope I tried to make it easy for you, but it was really long. So you can listen to it on, I don't know, 1.5 or something, 1.5 speed.